Hello everyone, it's a pleasure to make your acquaintance and welcome to my 5.8 Stygian Onslaught guide. As a preface, we'll mainly focus on difficulty 5, Fearless. That's because difficulty 3 you can match for, difficulty 4 you can co-op by inviting people to your world, whether that's through finding people to help on Discords or just asking people in co-op. Difficulty 5 is the first that you can only complete on your own. We're also not going to be looking a lot in detail at difficulty 6, mainly because it just requires more investment and has more HP. We're going to first look at the mechanics of the boss, what's changed, how they work in this game mode, and then we'll take a look at some teams that might be good for them. So let's get right into things. Let's first take a look at the tenebrous Papilla. So the Papilla can have 3 different types. This time we're facing type 2. Different types indicate which bosses it will transform into, and so this time it transforms into the mavuika, the Geobishop, and a bunch of the hypostases. Hypostases? You get the idea. And as usual, because it's just transforming to imitate them, it doesn't actually have the same mechanics that the bosses do. So for example, when the Geobishop does its area-wide attack, you can't reflect some damage by having a shield on yourself. Another thing that applies to both the regular and this version of the Papilla is that you'll get attrition marks on you from some attacks. These are indicated by the little icon on your health bar. You can tell when it's about to apply attrition damage with an attack because the wings or the leaves or whatever you want to call them will appear behind it. These are also always applied by the telegraphed spikes that appear on the ground during its ward charging up phase. Every time a mark is applied to you, your active character will then later lose about 10% health. And so if you have a character that's really low, just switch on to a more healthy character. Okay, now we can start looking at the mechanics which are unique to the Menacing version. First being its Abyssal Ward, that it instantly starts combat with one of these. It doesn't start with a charging up phase, it starts with the attack phases, where it imitates bosses and does their attacks. It will still have an Abyssal Ward for the entirety of this. And this Abyssal Ward isn't insignificant, it's 150 units worth, which means you need 150 elemental hits. As usual with all Void Wards, taking elemental damage of any type, so as long as it's not physical, increases that meter by 1 point. Night Soul hits increase the meter by 3 points, and that's why Night Soul is so encouraged. The regular Abyss version only has a 72 unit ward. The advantage here being that it's a lot more relaxed. It will go through its 8 attack phases before it starts charging up that area-wide attack. That only happens well after a minute into combat, which hopefully you'll have already broken the ward by then. A significant difference though to it having this Abyssal Ward the whole time is that because it's got the ward, it can't take damage. It means quite a few abilities change in how they work. The most significant factors being sacrificial weapons and Favonius weapons. Favonius weapons need you to do crit damage to trigger them, and sacrificial weapons need you to do skill damage. As you're doing neither of these, you're just increasing the ward's meter, you're not in fact doing any damage to it. None of these weapons will proc. So instead of using a Favonius weapon, you might want to think about other energy recharge weapons. And characters like Bennett, because you're getting less particles overall, you might want to run an energy recharge weapon like Sapwood or Skyward Blade. The other way this affects teams is that some characters need you to do types of damage to the opponent to trigger some of their abilities. Simple ones like Daya and Raiden's skill are coordinated attacks and so will only trigger when your character does damage to the opponent. Some more niche ones though are Auroron and Kenichi's abilities. Auroron's first Ascension passive allows him to do extra electro damage to the opponent when electro charge reactions trigger on the opponent and deal damage. But because you're not dealing any damage, these never trigger. Kenichi also gets more Night Soul points on his skill when you trigger burning damage on the enemy. Again, this is never triggering. Though in spite of me pointing these out, this is no way an indicator of a character's strength. Auroron and Kenichi are still excellent choices for the Papilla just because they deal a lot of Night Soul hits. This links back to one of the other big changes with the Papilla, which is that while it has this Abyssal Ward on it, any damage you're doing to it is recorded. When you break the Abyssal Ward on the Papilla, it will then take a portion of that damage as true damage. This gets converted at a higher rate for Night Soul aligned damage. This changes how you play against the Papilla. You might have seen one of my videos that goes over how to break the wards using just mavuika. You'll do normal attacks instead of charged attacks to break it as fast as possible. Here, that's not important. You don't need to break it as fast as possible. Instead, because it's recording the damage you're doing, you'll want to do your regular rotation, making sure you melt mavuika's burst and as many charged attacks as possible. Because all of that damage is then recorded, and then a portion of it will be done to the Papilla after you break it. For the same effect, this means taking a team that's designed just for breaking the ward and not doing any damage during that duration isn't as strong. For example, relying on Pyro main character To just on-field them to break the ward isn't as effective. Burning teams like Kanich will also do less of that true damage to the enemy after breaking the ward, because the majority of the hits you're doing to the enemy during that phase are burning hits. But in turn for that, you're breaking the ward faster. In fact, as the portion of damage that gets converted is lower for not Night Soul damage, if you're using a team with a high investment, say Arakino, some kind of burning team with Pyro main character, you can instead make sure Arakino stacks up as much Bond of Life as possible, but you on-field Pyro main character with some Dendro to break that Abyssal ward as fast as possible. Then as soon as it's broke, you switch to Arakino and you do all the damage that you can. This kind of reminds me of the Lava Dragon statue, in that some teams will want to try and get more breaks of the opponent's ward, whereas other teams that are more Night Soul focused will want to just do their regular rotations and do as much damage throughout the combat. This is because once you've broken that ward, it will then become vulnerable for about 18 seconds. You just want to do all the damage you can, and then it will regenerate that Abyssal ward of the same size, meaning you'll have to do this mechanic all over again. And that's really it for the mechanics of the Papilla. If you want some more information on the Papilla's ward, I did make a video a while ago looking at almost every character in the game and how fast they break through an Abyssal ward. But as I mentioned, because the ward is so big this time and you're recording the damage you're doing to it, cheese strats just to break the ward as fast as possible aren't really as effective here. Now we can take a look at some teams that will be able to deal with this boss well. Quickly want to go on a tangent to say there probably will be a lot of teams that I haven't thought of that are going to be able to complete this boss. That was really shown on last Stygian. There was a crazy amount of creative teams that people made to defeat these certain bosses with different amounts of investment on those characters. So here I'll go through the obvious teams and as many of the creative teams that I can think of and find. I was curious if you'd rather me delay this section a little later so I can give a more comprehensive view in the future. You'd rather me make another video down the line to point out some of the new teams that have been discovered for these things. Maybe a comprehensive team guide or something like that. In the meanwhile, we can take a look at the most blatant options that Hoyo wants us to play. First being Chaska. Chaska's always been good at the Papilla because they have so many hits in their skill. The fact that damage is now being recorded while doing this only makes them better, especially as it favors Night Soul damage. Chaska not only has a lot of Night Soul hits herself, but she also pairs really well with off-field Night Soul hitting characters. Characters like mavuika, Citlali, Oran all work well in her teams, alongside characters that are generally great buffers like Farina, which have some off-field hits themselves. Chaska also has a very large variety of teammates she can use of different elements. She makes things a lot more accessible and flexible. The only mainstay is that you'll need some kind of attack buffer, whether that's Eon, Sun, or Bennett. Another team that we know has worked really well in the past is Kanich. Kanich has a lot of hits in his kit himself, and burning helps accelerate stacking up that meter faster. As we said, the amount of damage that it takes when you break the ward will probably be less. Hopefully you'll be able to break it more often in these teams. Again, the difference between fighting this Papilla and the regular version is that you actually want to use your skills, your shots, during your skill against this Papilla. You're not just trying to break the ward as fast as possible, you're still trying to do as much damage as you can in the meanwhile. mavuika herself is also pretty good against this boss, and has a variety of teams that she'll work well in for defeating it. You can play her in the obvious melt teams with Citlali for more off-field application. Play her in an overload team with Shavras and Aura. You might even be able to make some kind of burning team work. The last Night Soul line character I've seen do very well is Veressa. Veressa works very well in an overload team as long as you're using a Night Soul aligned character instead of Xiangling, whether that's mavuika or Pyro main character. You need lots of off-field Night Soul hits. Again, just like Chaska, you will want an attack buffer in there, whether that's Bennett or Eon-san. If you do use Pyro main character, make sure you're pressing the tap skill and not the hold skill. The tap skill does more hits in general. What about teams that don't use Natlan carries? Now, admittedly, once you start looking outside Night Soul line characters, the investment does go up quite a lot. The clears I saw so far were with C2R1 Arakino. One of the examples was the aforementioned Burning team, where you stacked up a lot of Bond of Life while Pyro main character and Emily helped defeat the Abyssal Ward. Then you could dispense all of that stacked up Bond of Life to do as much damage as possible as soon as you'd broken the ward. The other version I saw was simply a melt team using off-field Citlali. The only other non-Night Soul carrier I saw that managed to clear the Papilla, admittedly at quite low investment, was a Skirk team. They used Citlali to help stack up that Night Soul faster, and the combination of Escoffier along with Farina doing all those off-field hits hit, and Skirk herself having a fast attack pattern with lots of hits meant that you broke the ward quite fast. That's really all the teams I've seen at lower investment clear the Papilla so far. Hopefully by knowing how its mechanics work, you can then go and think of some different options yourselves. If you find any other good team suggestions, feel free to comment below what you use to help people out. But in the meanwhile, let's go take a look at the next enemy, the Tortoise. This is a quite dangerous local legend, but the version we're facing in Stygian seems to have its claws removed. Tortoise itself doesn't have too many mechanics to it. It has higher physical and electro resistance, and you'll see a meter next to its name. Every time you do a hit to the Tortoise, this increases the meter by 3 points. This goes to a maximum of 30 points. It loses 2 points every half a second or 4 points a second. You don't really want it to reach 30 points, as once it reaches 30 points this meter goes away, and its next attack that it does summons a large electro ward on it worth 32 units. Hitting that electro ward and trying to break it will do counter damage, doing a significant amount of damage to your character. Or so you might have thought, but this has been toned down a lot for the Stygian version, and so the amount of damage that your characters take can be mitigated quite easily with a competent healer like a Escoffier. And you'll need to be really wary of its damage in teams where you're attacking the ward in the first place and triggering those counters. So because of the amount of time it takes to break the ward, ideally you don't want to do that. If it does summon a ward and you manage to break it, you'll have about 10 seconds afterwards of free time where it's not recording the hits that you do to do as much damage as possible. Alongside that, there's an attack that it can do very much like the Yumka Melting King. It spins about the arena. They've changed this again. Instead of it knocking you back, it simply does a bit of damage to you, which is a lot less threatening and annoying to deal with, as it no longer will waste an amount of time as you get knocked back. Though if you can't tell, the aim of this enemy is to not let it get its ward generated, meaning you do big chunks of infrequent damage. At least if it does get its ward up, to make sure you can break it really fast. There's really two different types of teams I've found that are able to do this really well. The first being that infrequent, large chunks of damage. Character that excels at that is Mualani. Mualani's teams often use buffers like Jillinan and Sucrose that don't do many off-field hits. The only off-field hits, in fact, that you really care about are the ones that apply Pyro. So you can use an off-fielder like Pyro main character, or an off-fielder like mavuika to do as few Pyro hits as possible. You can also use Burning for this with Nahida. For some reason, Burning doesn't count as a hit and so doesn't increase that meter. As we mentioned mavuika, we should probably also talk about her. She's another character that can also do big hits of damage. If you are melting everything, doesn't hit all that fast, and so she is an option that you can use in these teams. Another angle that I've seen work really well is plunge characters. A character like Garming, especially at high constellations, does a lot of damage with those plunge attacks. They're melting them all, and because they're plunge attacks, they're relatively infrequent. The same exact thing applies to Zhao. You can buff up Zhao as much as possible with Bennett, Ian-san, and Farazan to get him to do huge plunge damage. The off-fielders do very few hits. In fact, you can take a character like Arakino. Give her again characters that don't do very much off-field, like Bennett and Jillinan. Space out her attacks so you're only doing attacks when you've got very high bond of life. So you'll do, say, 4 attacks and then dash, wait a little bit and another 4 attacks, so you're not increasing that meter too fast. From what I've seen, Arakino does require a bit more investment herself. The other team that I've seen work really well has been a freeze team. This is usually using Escoffier. See clears with Ayaka and Ryze at higher investments, but at low investment you can use Skirk. Here you do a lot of attacks, enough to get that meter charged up, but the boss can be frozen. Freezing them delays them from getting this ward up. On top of that, because you're using a cryo on fielder, you break the ward quite fast. And so here you're kind of mitigating the mechanic and buying as much time while doing as many hits as possible. The Tortoise, out of all 3 of the bosses we're facing, feels the most flexible in team options. Expect there to be a lot more inventive and creative teams that clear it. Let's move on to the third and final boss, the Cactus. This is a new local legend that was introduced in the most recent region, so it's likely you won't have fought them before, so I'll go over their mechanics somewhat here. Its actual name is the Papilla Idol. As soon as combat starts, you'll see a meter next to its name. This meter slowly charges up over time, but if you apply Electro Charge or Lunar Charge to the enemy, it charges up faster. Then shortly, about 10 seconds after the start of combat, it starts its hat trick mechanic. Here it generates a Y ward on itself. It summons 3 hats and hides in one of them. These hats will be immune while they're switching places. You need to keep an eye on whichever hat it turned into and where that hat ends up. 2 of them are fakes and one of them's the real version. If you can't remember which one exactly it turned into, the one that it turned into will have a mustache on the hat and make sounds when you damage it. And each hat will have its own meter just like it did before. Again, this meter gets filled up when you trigger Electro Charged or Lunar Charged on the hat. When you fill this meter up to max, if you're at the wrong hat, nothing happens. If you're at the right hat, that ward will then lose 20% durability. On top of that, any damage you're doing to the hat will also decrease the white ward. Keep in mind that while it has this white ward, its resistance is increased to 135% to all elements, apart from Electro and Hydro. For doing damage with any elements that's not Electro and Hydro is pretty insignificant during this phase. The hats themselves have about 40% of the HP of the enemy itself, so they're pretty tanky. Not only does it have reduced resistances to Hydro and Electro specifically, but it also takes 300% damage from Electro Charge or Lunar Charge reactions, including the direct damage that endeavours does. While the hats are initially moving around, they're not targetable, so don't use things like Nervalet skill, otherwise it won't generate any spheres. And then you have about 40 seconds after the hats become vulnerable to be able to attack them. If you don't destroy the white ward of the hat that they're hiding behind in time, they don't take any damage, they don't become vulnerable, and there's also a pretty dangerous area-wide attack. Finally, once you do manage to break that white ward, he will then lose all those really high resistances, having minus 90 resistance to all elements. Minus 90 means is that not only are you doing significantly increased damage, but resistant shred to the enemy is relatively insignificant because it already has really low resistances. And alongside that, it will take a chunk of damage, much like the Papilla does, where that damage that he takes is based on the amount of Hydro, Electro, Lunar Charged, and Electro Charged damage the hat took while its white ward was being broken. As the white ward of the hats carries over all Electro, Hydro, Electro Charge, and Lunar Charge damage, if you have a team with a really strong Electro damage dealer, like say Overload Varessa, she's doing a significant portion of the damage but not breaking that white ward very fast. As long as you break it by the end, it might take longer to happen, but they'll take a huge amount of damage when you break that ward, as they'll take all of the Electro damage that was stored up on it. Have these really low resistances for about 13 seconds, and they'll generate that meter again on themselves, returning back to a regular base 10 resistance, and starting the mechanic shortly after all over again. The meter has a bit more significance now. Picking up the meter faster will cause it to enter the hat mechanic sooner, though it will eventually enter this mechanic anyway. This takes about 30 seconds. This boss probably has the most narrow selection of teams available for it, because either way, you're going to need Electro Charged or Lunar Charged in some form. The only teams I've found that can work around this is teams with really high Electro or Hydro damage, as long as they can break the wards of the hats in time. And obviously, any team that includes endeavours is going to be excellent at this. Endeavours is going to make this boss almost trivial and a hell of a lot easier. I've seen it clear with just endeavours herself, no constellations, no signature weapon, and only 4-star teammates, and she's able to carry them through. You can also pair competent carries like Varessa or Nervalet with endeavours to make that easier. If you're going for characters outside of endeavours, I've seen a Varessa clear with 4-star teammates be competent, and obviously you can use strong Hydro carries like Nervalet and Farina, though they might need a bit more investment. I even saw a Chlorand clear where it was C0 Chlorand with Mist Splitter. She was able to deal with it. The thing I've noticed to make this easier is that you don't run an Animo character in these teams. Instead, you take just Electro and Hydro damage dealers. You don't really need any defenses as the enemy doesn't do that much damage, and you focus on just doing as much Electro and Hydro damage as possible. Taking teammates like High Constellation Fischl, Jinchul, Yelan are really valuable, as the hats can be broken in 2 ways, by reactions or specific damage types, so Hydro or Electro. You can choose to go down one of those paths really hard. For example, you take a team that I mentioned earlier, like a Varessa Overload team, that does purely Electro damage, doesn't do any of the reaction damage, and uses that specifically to break the ward. Because this ward is 40% of the HP of the enemy, as long as you're breaking it in time, you're doing 40% of the enemy's HP as soon as you break it. That's followed by a vulnerable phase, so as long as you can get 2 of these ward breaking's done with a team like that, you should be good to go. On the other hand, you can kind of ignore this mechanic. Take a Hydro character and an Electro character that have strong application, something like Jincho and Fischl. Use them to break the hats with their application rather than the damage they're doing. Take a carry of a completely different element like Arekino to do pyro damage to the enemy while they're vulnerable. A Hyper Bloom team works on the same concept, where you're still doing electrocharge damage, but the main damage that you're doing is Dendro. You won't do much damage to the hat phase, but as long as you can get enough damage out while it's weakened, you should be good to go. So although this enemy feels the most restrictive in the elemental options you have, I think it's still quite flexible. A lot more than last Stygian Onslaught was either way, so I'm happy about that. And that's all 3 of the bosses and all the advice I have for you. If you have any more questions or thoughts, stick them down in the comments and I'll try to answer as many as I can. And anything incorrect or any corrections or more information that we find out, I'll try to pin in the comments. Lastly, if you enjoyed this, a comment or interaction is always appreciated, or even sharing it with someone else that you thought might find it useful. If you want to make sure you catch my endgame guides next time, you could subscribe or join Discord or follow me on Twitter or Twitch, etc, etc. You get the idea. Thank you very much for watching all the way to the end. I hope you found this useful, and I'll see you all next time. Best of luck. Bye!